embracing that evolution, embracing that adaptability makes you a man who can actually be a positive influence, not only for the fluidity of life in general, but also for your own happiness. You're not stuck in this myopic view thinking that there's only one way to live.
Welcome to another episode of the Doc Jock Show. Those of you who have been watching my show or listening to my show, I've had one of my bros on here before, the Johnny Elsasser, the wild man himself. So Johnny, thank you for being on yet again. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day and joining us.
Yeah, always, brother. You know, I'm a big supporter of you, how you teach people, how you educate people, and just honored to always be on the show and be considered to come back on. You know, I'm not banned yet from your show, so we'll try to change that this episode.
Yeah. Well, this time too, I made sure I hit record on everything as well, so we don't lose anything that we set out to record this time. So,
oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah, bring that harsh memory back up. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking, and before we hit the record button, Johnny was just talking about this too. Chapter 8, right, of your book is kind of going into some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So for those of you who are following me, following Johnny, just watch out for his book to be launched this year. I'm excited. You know, I'll be one of the first ones to get a copy because I want to read it. But the topic of today is something that I feel called to talk about. I know Johnny does a lot of work with coaching men. You've got the wild men experiences where it's just really just stepping it up and having men step it up, not just by themselves, but stepping up in their relationships. So Johnny, I want to just start just super basic. How can men best show up in the relationship for their women?
Oh man, it's such a good question. And like I was telling you, it's chapter 8. It's, I call that the victim and the assailant. And there's a reason for that. If you guys get the book, you'll understand why. But part of this is the victim mentality plays a huge role in our relationships. We create a lot of expectations and we create a lot of processes in which we logically look at things, how we would perform them and all that stuff. When we ask our partner to do something, whether it's to take care of the kitchen because you're taking care of the kids, right? When you try to balance your life, and essentially, when you ask them to take care of something while you're doing something else, a lot of times what happens is if that person doesn't do it on your timeline or complete the task in the level that you would complete it or whatever it is, a lot of times we get very angry and then we play a victim as to it didn't get done because of the fact that we didn't do it and it's their fault that it didn't get done and now it's a burden on my life. And so it causes a lot of resentment from men and does women as well. But speaking specifically to men, I see this very often because I did this a lot and I still fight this in my life. Like everything in my book and everything I tell people on my podcast or that I coach men, it's not because I feel like I'm higher than you guys. I just feel like I've made that misstep a little earlier and then tried to change it maybe a little faster. But ultimately, I'm in the same boat. I did this shit all the time. And I had this even in my current marriage, like even up till like just a couple years ago, you know, I was still struggling a lot with this because I would harbor around resentment when she didn't do something the way that I asked her to do it. Or I wouldn't even say the way I asked her to do it because I wouldn't even be clear about how I wanted it done. I would just ask her to do something. And then she, being a woman, has a completely different way her brain processes to get this action done. And me being a man, I have a completely different way I process getting this action done. So I say all of this to say that, you know, we play that victim and then we act as though that the outcomes in our lives in general. So now I'm going to move this to a bigger picture, but in general, we act like all the outcomes in our lives are deferred to other people or other circumstances. And then we carry that perspective back into relationships, except we have a person to point to. We have our spouse, right? Or our partner, right? We have them to point to and say, you're the reason. So you still play the victim. You just have a more pinpointed objective of who the problem is. And we do this, we build resentment, we build anger, and then this is what causes us to have those big blowout fights, or this is what causes us to walk around making passive aggressive, snarky comments to our partner. Like this is what causes a lot of problems in our relationships. And that to me is a big piece where men can step up their game. And the first thing I tell guys, and this is what I started to do, because my biggest thing, like being former military, I'm not like OCD, but I like my space to be clean. I'm very clean. I love my space to be clean. Like that's like my thing. And I've been that way since I was a kid, but it got exacerbated when I was in the military as well. And for me, the biggest space was like the kitchen, because when I go to bed, I want that kitchen clean. So when I get up in the morning, I'm out there, fresh, clean space. And like, I'm not sitting there looking at dirty dishes. That's a huge thing for me. Yeah. So my wife, on the other hand, didn't necessarily grow up with that mindset. And so like I would, it didn't happen very often, but there would be like a couple times I'd get up and there's dishes in the sink. And I'm like, what the hell? And it's not like piles of dishes, only 2 of us, but like there's a couple dishes in the sink. I'm like, what the hell, man? Like I've asked you to not do this. And so I would build that resentment. And then I would ask myself, well, why am I getting angry at this? Like she's got a different process that may not affect her the way it affects you. And not only that, but if you're going to take complete ownership, what's the problem of you cleaning that dish the night before if she just left it in the sink? And then asking her, hey, if you don't mind, could you just make sure like not to do that at nighttime? Because I don't like to wake up to that. And I'm usually the first up in the morning, right? Like there's a whole process there I started to have to challenge myself to go through to be like, okay, if you're holding resentment, that's because you're playing a victim to this scenario right now. And you need to change that. Stop playing the victim and take ownership. The ownership is you chose not to clean the dish before you went to bed because you guys didn't go to bed at different times. Yeah. You chose not to ask her about this and say, hey, could you do that? You chose to get angry and resentful and harbor that and then carry that into the relationship the next day. All of this is a choice. And so for better or for worse, like we have to take responsibility in that. And for me, when you take that ownership, you're taking ownership of all the excuses that even seem justified, right? Like, cause you will justify excuses back. No, Johnny, this is a completely legitimate reason to be angry. No, it's not. It's not, I promise you. Take ownership. You're choosing to be angry because you need to take ownership of the things that led you there and what story you're allowing yourself to make you get angry, right? Because that's the other piece is we create a story. Like there could be, I know this too. Again, if she left the dishes in the sink and then I was like, oh, she just didn't do it because she didn't want to do what I said. Story, right? Reality could have been like, oh my God, she had something else on her mind. She wanted to post something on Instagram because she runs her business on there. She wanted to post something on Instagram and totally lost track of cleaning that dish or those dishes, right? So like, remember, we also create stories and those stories are linked back to past situations in our lives, which then proactively enact emotions that we have. And then those emotions create the response that we have to the scenario. It's a whole system, but we're very complex creatures and this is what we do. So remember that the stories you also create may or may not be real. And so you will think they're real to you because you created them, which will then employ whatever emotion that is associated with that story. But that story may not actually be the real story to why this happened. So remember that. So that ownership piece is huge.
Yeah, I like how you said that too, man, where it's like kind of the way that you were wording that, the buzzword that came to head was like epigenetics, right? Like your perception of the problem, your perception of the situation, you have a choice to either see it for what it is and take ownership of it, or you have a choice to push it onto and deflect onto your spouse, or if you have kids, like you push it onto your kids when, you may not know the actual story, the real truth about the scenario. So I think that's huge, man. Really is. What other problems do you see? I have a couple that I've got that I see, but what other problems do you see besides the dishes? What other problems do you see with communication in relationships as well that are common pitfalls that a lot of guys will fall into?
Well, there's 2 that I see. And the first one is men aren't clear in their communication. So like, for instance, my wife and I were doing some couples coaching and one of the guys in there, if I remember this story correctly, something was happening with the dog inside, that the dog was a mess. I don't know if it was muddy or whatever. And he needed to get outside. So he's carrying the dog, or the dog was pooping. I don't know, but he was carrying the dog and he didn't have a hand to open the door. And he gets mad at his wife for not opening the door for him to get the dog out. Yeah. Well, if you guys just listen to the story, what was the missing piece?
He never
asked to have the fucking door open. right? So like, but we will again create that story of them not paying attention to us, of them not thinking logically. So one of the things that I come across with men is clear communication. Like, so many men are scared of getting in an argument or not. Oh man, if we get in an argument, I'm not going to get sex tonight. Sex is completely off the table now, right? Like, so I'm just not going to do it, right? Or I don't feel like getting it. No, man, like, if they're getting in an argument with you because you're clearly conveying something and you're not being disrespectful and you're not attacking them, that's something that they're dealing with, but that's also something you signed up for when you married that person and you knew that about them, right? Yeah. So like, you guys have to start having clear communication. But when guys start to have that and their wives see that, then all of a sudden their wives are like, oh man, it's going to rub off on them. They're going to be like, oh, well, maybe I should communicate a little better with him too, or maybe I should be open to hearing him. And that's part of the clear communication. It's like, hey, sitting down, and you and I have had conversations about this, and I do this with my wife too, is like, I employ this same exact tool. Is I will sit down with her when we're in a completely neutral environment. There's no heated argument. There's nothing that went on that day that provoked emotions. And I'll say, hey, babe, I've been meaning to talk to you about something. You have time for this? And she'll be like, yeah, I got a few minutes. I'll be like, hey, I just wanted to ask you, like, when I talk to you about maybe a couple of things that I would like us to do as a couple, or I'd like to ask you to do, can I do that in a way that's not going to make you feel attacked, right? So you get into this open conversation with them where now you can have a completely highly communicative conversation where they're not feeling attacked, and you're enabled to share your perspective, your emotions. And that's the other thing. That's the second piece, is share your emotions. Hey, babe, this hurts me when you say this. Like, that doesn't make me feel good when you do that. You know, when we start saying those things, women start to realize that we aren't the Tin Man, right? We do have or is it the Tin Man or the Lion? The Lion doesn't have a heart, right? The Tin
doesn't
Man,
have a heart.
What does he not have? Yeah.
A brain? I think a brain? I don't know.
No, that's the Scarecrow, right?
Heart? I don't know. Oiling can? I don't know.
Yeah, whatever. We're one of these. Yeah, we're one of these. One of those fucking characters from the Wizard of Oz. But women, just as men are programmed to have a specific interpretation of what men and masculinity is. And part of that is that at a certain age, men are perceived as being hardened and unemotional and all these things. Now, while women will say, we understand men have emotions, a lot of women don't act that way. And they really are like, well, I just didn't know that you felt that way because you just seem to always block everything, or you seem to always have this air of like toughness about you. It's like, no, even the toughest guys get hurt, get their feelings hurt. Even the toughest guys still want to be loved. And it's like, we have to remember to speak that out. And so for men, that communication piece, from conveying clearly what you desire to also conveying clearly how you feel. It's both of those pieces that keep your relationship super healthy. And that's what keeps you guys thriving as a couple. Because when you can get that piece in place, bro, there's almost nothing you guys can't make it through, because the fact that you're always going to be honest and open with one another. And that right there creates a lot of safety, and it creates a lot of love between you guys.
Yeah. And that trust piece too. And I think that's huge, with being able to trust your spouse and being able to feel safe enough to be able to open. And I work with a lot of men too, where they're afraid, or they create this narrative in their mind that they can't share their emotions because then they'll be seen as vulnerable or wusses or whatever the hell you want to call it. Betas, they're afraid to, right? But it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, you and I kind of share this value, I feel, is that, like, you know, strong men share their feelings, they share their emotions, they're in tune with themselves. You have to have that balance between the masculine and feminine. If you want a strong relationship, I feel like you need to be able to suck it up and try it. And if your wife comes at you and makes fun of you for, you know, being softer and you know, using your emotions, and, you know, you probably have something else you need to work through, but you should feel safe in those environments, right?
Yeah. And the other thing is with that is, guys that feel like they can't share those things are men who aren't confident. So for all intents and purposes, you use the term beta, and there's a whole thing that I just, a whole piece of my content, I went on beta stuff. I can explain a little bit more into that. But with that is the fact that even to consider yourself, you know, nobody wants to be a beta, right? Like, and that's not even the correct term we should use because that's a social construct. Beta in and of itself, when you look at its definition, just means the second in command. So in a beta is used in a hierarchical structure. Not the social construct is made up by the media, right? That's not an actual true definition of what a beta male is. A beta male is the second in command. So when men, I digress, but when men get into this version of not quote unquote being the alpha, majority of you aren't the alpha anyways, motherfucker. Like you are sitting there and you're being weak as shit and not confident because you can't even have a simple conversation with fucking words. Like that to me is like, you were never the alpha anyways. So thinking that you're going to be a beta is a whole fallacy because you're already pretty much the beta or the gamma or the delta or the omega, whichever one you want to associate with. Right. So like, it doesn't matter. So for me, when people have that conversation, it's like, well, you're already being the thing you're fearing. You're literally already being the thing you're fearing. So you may as well just take the leap and try not being the thing you're fearing and actually be the man that is strong and confident in himself to say, hey, I feel a little hurt. Hey, I don't feel like that's very respectful to me or our relationship to yell at me and I'm your husband. Like that's not how I feel a healthy communication could be, right? Like saying things like I feel this way opens the door for the women to see you in another light. And for you guys to build an actual loving relationship based on feelings and emotions of each other.
I just came up with a good thing for the walking in the dark. All right. So I feel like an analogy for this, right? Where a lot of us, cause I'm like thinking like invisible fences where like, we don't know where the hell the boundaries are. Like we're a dog, we're walking around and we get zapped. But to me, it's more like you're walking around in the dark when you have a relationship that you don't communicate well with, because we don't know where our spousal boundaries are. So we have our eyes closed and we're trying to like feel it out. And then we run into a wall and like, that fucking hurt. Like, what was that? And that's a boundary that your spouse could have told you, but didn't tell you. And so you randomly walk into it. And I feel like a lot of people in relationships, when you don't have clear boundaries, you're walking around like that. And then you step on something and you're like, the fuck? Like, I didn't know that was going to set you off. What, like, why? Let's learn from that. Let's ask questions on that. And then it's an opportunity to learn to make your relationship closer. So don't walk around in the dark, I think is what I want to kind of say on that.
It's also the fact that like, you know, you're sitting there and you have the teacher who created the test right in front of you and the teacher saying, hey, if you just ask me the questions, I'll actually give you the answer to the test. Like if you just, but we play this game of trying to make the other one figure out what it is they're supposed to be doing. I mean, think about, it's inherent. Think about gift giving, you know, I don't know when this is going to come out, but we're getting close to like Valentine's Day and we just came through Christmas, right? And people guess about fucking gifts to get people. And it's like, why? Just ask them, what do you want? Like what would fill your cup up that I could get you, right? That may be something you haven't bought yourself. Like start asking, and people are like, well, the mystery, Johnny, fuck off. It's not the mystery. It's a relationship, bro. It's a relationship. The relationship is built on strength. And when you are in a strong relationship, you are clear with each other. You're open about what's going on. And you're asking like you said, you're asking the questions like, oh, I didn't know. Let's talk a little bit more about that so I can understand you a little more. So maybe the next time this comes up, I can actually be like, okay, how can I best support you? Because I know you're still being triggered by something, right? But you have the teacher, both sides of the fence, the women and the men. You have the fucking teacher who's giving you the test right in front of you, who's willing to give you the answers if you just ask them. And that to me is where we fail as human beings, is that we should just be like, hey, so question number 2 says this. What's the answer to question number 2? Is it A, B, C, or D? Oh, there's an E? Cool. I'm gonna pick that one because you said that's the one you really like.
All the above.
Got it. Yeah. Like it's just having that, again, having that you have the answers in front of you, use that person to give you the correct answers and stop trying to play guesswork like you're taking your SATs.
Well, it's like you're guessing too, because I've seen guys do this as well, girls as well. Like you'll do it as though it is like a pop quiz test, like, oh, Valentine's Day is coming. Let's see how well my spouse knows me.
Yeah.
And it's like they get you something, you're like, what the hell is that? Like you're purposely alluring or alluding to the fact that you're going to have an argument because you weren't clear. Nobody talked about it, nobody communicated with it. Like Meg and I, we just had a date night this past weekend, and I straight up said, what do you want for Valentine's Day? I got an idea of what I think would be good for you. I told her she has 2 more sound bowls that she needs to complete her whole sound bowl collection. I'm like, are you good with that? We'll go to Sedona. We'll do a day trip out of it. We'll get you a couple bowls and I'll complete your set. And she's like, holy shit. Yeah, absolutely. Like, let's do it. Boom. Valentine's Day is done a month in advance. Like, I got it. Like, this isn't a hard thing. Like, I succeed. I got 100%. I got a scratch and stiff, strawberry sticker. I'm like, I got 100% on it. But like, you can do that. You should be able to do that. Otherwise, that guesswork is where a lot of like distrust comes. Like, oh, you don't know me. You don't know me anymore. You don't know what I want.
Yeah.
And like, why are you even putting your relationship in jeopardy like that?
Yeah, you're setting each other up for failure. And it's like, I don't know why that would be the case. Like, I have so many other problems. I don't need a problem to be my relationship. Like, I have so much other shit to deal with. I don't need my wife and my relationship to be my problem. I need that to be my strength. Right. Yeah. And so enhance that by asking the right questions and deepen your sexual connection when you guys actually know each other better too. Like, that's the other benefit of this is like when you communicate clearly and you communicate your emotions and you guys connect on those levels, your sex life gets a lot better. All of a sudden she wants to have sex more often, or all of a sudden you guys have longer sessions and they're more deeply intimate. Like, there's all of these things that compound when you start having that better communication, because women are not like men. Women are not that physical vision creature. They need that's why they say women are crockpots, right? Like, it's that emotional buildup that gets them sexually in tuned and connected to you. It's not I see a chick in a thong and I'm super turned on already. Like, they have they have kind of an opposite structure in how that works. And with that, we should be enhancing that by being communicative, because that helps to build that emotional connection and helps to start simmering that crock pot at a higher temperature so you guys can end up having a better intimate relationship.
Yeah, it makes so much sense when you just talk about and you just air it out there, and why people don't do it or still don't do it. I don't get it. But one of the things that see, that's true. Yeah, fear and insecurity, because most people are operating out of some level of insecurity out there. They shouldn't be insecure in a relationship, but it happens. And the thing that I see a lot, and I want to kind of pick your brain on this, and Ellie and I were actually just kind of talking about this. One of the problems that I see for my patients quite often, like I'll throw a random, like 40% of my patients, which is too much, deal with an entrepreneurial husband that basically treats his business like a mistress and doesn't pay any attention to the spouse at home, to the wife at home. How do you speak to men in that realm of things?
It's a great question. And this actually plays also in relation to women who are on their entrepreneurship journey, because I've heard this a lot from their side as well, from not only women who reach out to me, but also women who work with my wife. And so this isn't an unknown thing for women, but let's just focus on men, because obviously men are more predisposed to this because of, how society's evolved. So with men that are doing that, first off, like, you got to prioritize, like, what is important to you. First off, when a man is doing that, his priority is his work. It's not his wife. So that's the first thing. And you can't change that. There's nothing I can tell that guy, or no tool I can give him. That man is, for all intents and purposes, going to be that man until he makes the decision that his wife and his relationship is most important. So there's nothing that we're going to say on this show, and there's nothing that a guy's going to tell him other than the fact that he needs to look at his priorities. And if that's his priority, then that's his priority. That's what he feels is important in his life. Like, that's just it. And, guys, there's guys that business is more important than relationships, right? That is what makes them feel successful. But this is also part of their construction of what masculinity is to them too. So when you dive into their foundation of masculinity, at some point in their construction of what they thought a good man was, or what they thought a successful man was, business, money, power, whatever it is, was at the forefront of that. And so if that version of a man creates the confidence in who he is as a man, and he's put that in his hierarchical structure of traits, then his wife is always going to come second. because he believes that if he's a strong man, to be a good man for her, he's already convinced himself that is the priority. So there's a couple of combinations of things here that we have to look at. It's the structure of masculinity that the guy's developed for himself, and then it's the prioritization of his life. You know, there's men who really hold their relationships high, and then that is part of their structure as a man, and then they lose themselves in their job because they start to see success. So for those guys, it becomes a recalibration of priorities, right? But for the guy that values the power, money, wealth, and entrepreneurship and status, that values that to equal his value of a man, then that guy has a different conversation. So he's got to question his foundation as a man, and is that still important to him? And if it's not, then he's got to recalibrate that structure and that foundation of masculinity within him, which is what I teach guys to do. But he's got to restructure that so that he can be more authentic with the guy that he wants to be moving forward. So those are two separate conversations. But at the end of the day, it has to be a choice. And you know this is one of the things that, like, men, it doesn't matter if you and I are sitting there in front of the dude telling him all the answers that could get him A's on the test. If that motherfucker does not want to listen, or he has not bought into it, he is no way, shape, or form going to change. That is it. Like, he is going to stay in his old ways because those are comfortable to him. Those are knowns. What happens when we step out of that and get to the unknown? That's where fear comes in, because again, back to where we started this podcast, that's where the stories get made up. And then even though the stories may not be real, it doesn't matter. They're real to him. So the comfort zone's where he stays. He doesn't make a choice to change. And then he's going to continue to struggle with the relationship. And for that, then it becomes on the partner to say, hey, is that the kind of man I want to be married to? Is that the kind of person I want to be in a relationship with? We're all fucking adults. I don't like this. This is where, again, we go back to the beginning of the podcast, this victim mentality. Take ownership. If you're confident in who you are and what you can do in this world, it doesn't matter if that person is in your life or not. You are going to be a good person and successful in who you want to be. That should be all it is. And this is why the whole movement of anything that has to do with self-development, I don't care who's preaching it or what kind of style they're utilizing. There's one philosophy, one prevailing philosophy. Love yourself before you love anybody else, because nobody else should make you 100% a person. You should be 100% a person before anybody. A child gets introduced to your life, another person gets introduced to your life. It doesn't matter. You should be 100% a person, a whole person in love with who they are before anybody else. If we can just all subscribe to that first, this kind of bullshit with guys who neglect their wives or their kids and stuff like that, who aren't willing to recalibrate, that kind of bullshit will fall to the wayside, because people will be like, well, bro, that's cool. That's not what I want. I want somebody who prioritizes me a little more. So I think I'm going to have to step away from this. And yeah, it sounds easier when we're sitting here talking from fucking 30,000 foot view, but I've been divorced. I had to make that decision for myself. I'm not, like I told you when I started this podcast, I'm not speaking from a place of the unknown. I actually went through this and I had to make that decision for myself. So everybody has the ability to do that. We all just have to be willing to step into that unknown. We have to be willing to step into that fear, and we have to really be able to ask the right questions of ourselves and know that we always have us. That's it. We only have who we are, because everything else at any moment could go away because you're not in control of that.
Yeah. And I actually did this, and by the time this comes out, she will have already received this, but there's a patient I was meeting with yesterday, and we were talking about just in business. She's single, but in business, she's letting her clients basically dictate, her life, when she works, how long she works. She's constantly on call. And then she started sacrificing her diet, started sacrificing her exercise, sacrificing like this. And I'm like, whoa, like you got to, like they tell you on an airplane, put your oxygen mask on first before you put anybody else's on. So I actually sent her an oxygen mask for her to, it was like a little $5 thing. I like gift wrapped it, sent it to her, and I want her to keep it on her desk. So that way, when she is in those moments, she remembers like, hey, I need to take care of myself first, because you can't help anybody else. You're not going to show up in your relationship at 100%. And I'll be the first one to speak on this, is that when Hoyt came out, I told you, bro, like I went to the gym maybe 4 times in 2 years after Hoyt was born. And I was like, I need to be home. I need to do this. I need to be the best version of myself here. And yeah, I needed to do that for sure. And I wanted to, but then I felt like a lazy piece of shit, and I lost muscle. And I was like, man, I've worked 30 some years to develop who I am, like how I look. And I threw it all away because I thought I needed to sacrifice myself for the kid. When in reality, I need to set the example of like, I'm going to put myself first because I want him and Sage too. I want both of them to learn how to take care of yourself first. And a segue of this is, how can men then raise the next generation of men and women even in this ideology? How can we best raise our kids?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And I think this is a very important question, because we're in a place where, depending on your age right now, that next generation is very important, because they're going to be the ones that either evolve masculinity or men or society in general, whatever you want to look at. They're going to be the ones to evolve it or keep it in a place that has been toxic for a long time. The societal toxicity of negativity and unpreparedness and lack of positivity and all these other things that are really plaguing society today. And for men, the first thing is, again, you have to look at you. You know, what were you taught as a man, or what were you taught as a boy that prepared you to quote unquote become a man? Because I am not convinced we have a lot of men in this world. We have a lot of boys in men's bodies, but we don't have a lot of men in this world. Right. So the whole thing is that for me, you have to have those real conversations with yourself. You need to get serious with yourself and be like, what are my shadows? What are my triggers? What is my trauma? Like, what are the things that really hurt me? Like, how can I become a better man that's teaching not only the younger generation how to be self-aware and to say that there are things that, you know, were excluded from masculinity that are actually permitted for masculinity? How do we incorporate that conversation to ourselves first to then impact the next generation? The kids play off of, and I'm a firm believer in this, Bandura's social learning theory. And kids play off this because they can't speak words early on. And from ages 2 to 8, kids are in theta, right? So they can't really speak. They can understand kind of what you're saying, but then they see actions, and they base their actions, and then all the things that start to get categorized in their brain starts imprinting itself in those young ages. When they see that, that is what's going to influence them as they get older, and what's going to end up, you know, gravitating them in certain directions as they get to a more conscious space. So if you are aware of who you are and how you're influencing that next generation, what they see of you, how you act, how you speak to people, how you treat yourself, i.e. going to the gym, eating a clean diet, not sitting in front of a fucking TV all the time, not playing video games all the time, going outdoors and just experiencing the world. When they see those things, they're going to think that that's okay as they get older, and they're not going to question it. And they're going to be like, cool, like this is what I was taught. And for boys, this is incredibly important because they're seeing how to be a man, right? For girls, they're seeing the kind of man they're going to be attracted to. And so just remember that, especially as fathers, like what you exemplify to a girl, a young daughter in your life, she is going to look for that. If she has respect for you, let's put it this way, she will end up looking for that in the man that she marries or the men that she dates, right? And so that is going to be the things that we need to look at. So for us, it starts here in our generation, and it says, hey, we need to start having these real conversations. And I had to have these. Dude, I was very confident in who I was. I was in an alpha male environment. We were special operations. I did protection. I did all this shit. I had a very high standard for who I was. And I still had to sit down and say, none of this is working right now. So what do I need to change? I got to go back to ground zero. I need to start recalibrating myself. And that's not easy to do. I understand that. But it's necessary to do, because guess what? We are creatures of adaptability and evolution. If we can't adapt and we can't evolve, we are going to die. And we are going to give the next generation a death sentence. That's all we're doing. So we need to be, as men, highly adaptable, and we need to embrace evolution, because society has vastly changed from when you were handed the prescription of masculinity to what is kind of acceptable today, and also what influences other people today. What influencing them back 30 years ago isn't the same thing. right? We have a completely different set of standards and societal constructs. We have to acknowledge that. And so the people that want to be stuck in the past, stay in the past, go ahead, but you're handing that next generation a death sentence, right? And you're also taking away your own joy and happiness, because I guarantee you, you're kind of a bitter little asshole, right? And so that's what we see a lot of these guys stuck in. They're very negative, they're judgmental, they don't love themselves. They feel like being a martyr is the only way to be a good man, which it's not. You're teaching the next generation to just be martyrs, which again, it's living in death. But this is what's going on. And so embracing that evolution, embracing that adaptability makes you a man who can actually be a positive influence, not only for the fluidity of life in general, but also for your own happiness. You're not stuck in this myopic view thinking that there's only one way to live.
Dude, I love that. There's so much like this, God, you kind of made me just speechless on that one. That's awesome. The prescription of masculinity too. Like, I haven't heard you say that before, but these are things that like you and I have talked about that, because I did go through like that martyrdom state, which is again where I would sacrifice myself with the kids to make sure that I'm home, to do all these things. And it's this tough thing where, you know, like when I was growing up, my dad was totally different than what I am. Right. And so like I set, because I didn't like exactly how I raised. So I chose to do, or try to do as quickly the exact opposite of him. And then I'm stuck here. I'm like, well, I mean, this is working for me, but also like, I understand now why my childhood was the way that it was. So then you kind of like relearn it and you mesh it into like this perfect ball that like, I'm doing the best I can with my kids. My dad didn't martyrdom anything. He just, like, I love him to death. He's a little jackwagon. He knows that. But like his definition of man back then was completely different. It was all based off of like how successful I was in sports. And I knew that growing up, like my significance was, you know, get good grades, but like be amazing at sports, be amazing in bodybuilding. And that's what's going to make you successful in life. So I carried some of those principles over, and I used to have anger and resentment towards the gym. And then I turned it into, well, now I get the opportunity, and I'm grateful that my dad got me into working out back then, because he taught me a formulation to be healthy. And now I can choose to pass that down to my children. So if you had to say, what is the most important thing that you would tell any man listening here today on how to be a man, what would be like the one thing you would try to like pinpoint on? I know it's a really hard question to answer.
No, I mean, it's actually a lot easier than you think, to be honest, because it's not that I would say there's no consistency cross-culturally on how to specifically be a man. There isn't. When you look into the definitions of masculinity and masculine, they're very ambiguous. So they essentially tie back to just being a male, right? Pretty ambiguous. So when you say like how to be a man, the thing that I say is if we reframe that, it's how to be authentic to you. And the question that you have to ask yourself is, who is it that I want to show up in the world, that when I walk away from any scenario, whether it's a conversation, whether it's an activity, whether it's a social event, whatever it is, what is the man that I need to be to walk away from that, where I don't have any type of grief, any type of pain, any type of negativity towards myself on what I said and how I presented myself, right? Like when we can relieve ourselves of shame and guilt, because this is what men really carry. Men carry shame and guilt like a badge of honor. And so if we can say, what is the man that I need to be to show up where I don't have any shame and guilt after I leave that experience, that is the man. That is how I should be a man. Because that is what it is. It's authenticity. Because when you have that, then you're very confident in any situation you're at. You're very confident in the way that you respond to people, the way you treat people, the way you speak to people, the way you treat yourself. If this encompasses all different scenarios, when you present that man, no matter where you go, then you're always going to be somebody of high value and of honor and integrity, because you owned your authenticity. Right. And so that's where we get this ability to say, like, what's a way to be a good man, or what's a way to be a strong man in this world? Well, it comes back to the person individually. And I know people don't maybe want to hear that, but for all the research I've done, there's no structure or consistency amongst men and masculinity. Cross-culturally, it's always different. What values are in Alabama as a man are different from what are in New York City, right? There's just, there's not a conversation where they're going to be speaking the same language on their values for masculinity, right? And so we have to recognize that. And if we do, then we can have the real conversation, which is, being a strong man is what is consistent with my value system of being a good man in my life and to people around me. And I think that's where the real conversation has to be had for all of us men individually first. And to recalibrate that, it takes a lot of work. None of this shit's easy, man. Like it's all going to take work. It's all hard conversations. It's all writing. It's all allowing yourself to ask questions and to be open to having the right answer. Cause you know, if you're going to lie, I mean, you can't lie to yourself, bro. Like, you know, everything. Yeah. It's like, I can't lie to me. I can lie to Jacque, but I can't lie to me. So if I ask myself the real questions, if I ask myself the real questions, I can't run from that. And so that's why it's hard. And that's why men don't want to do it. And that's why we numb out with vices. And that's why we numb out with work. And that's why we numb out with TV and sports and everything else that you can list. It takes us away from actually getting real with ourselves on what authenticity looks like to us, and then giving ourselves the tools on how to show up that way in our lives. That's where the important conversation for me needs to be had. And that's what I tell guys all the time. And there's a way to recalibrate that, but you got to be willing to do it first. And you have to understand, or I would say you have to objectively look at how you're showing up in life and assess if you're happy with it or not, you know, because if we're constantly living from a prescription that was given to us and not written by us, if we're constantly living in that, well, then we're not actually living up to a standard we created for ourselves. How could it be authentic to who we are? It couldn't be. It never could be. So that's really the conversation I see that we need.
I love it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see a lot of anxiety and depression nowadays is we're going down, like, we've got like two rivers, right? And you're going down the river and you're trying to look upstream, like, shit, I wanted to go over there, but my boat's taking me over there. It's like, are you willing to get out of the boat, go upstream to jump onto another boat on the path of life that you actually want to choose? And I think very few men are willing to embrace that suck to do it.
If I was told that, and I'm going to use, I'll use this as an example. I actually believe this to be a strong man, so I value this, but not every guy does. But to be a protector, right? Like, so if you were told you have to be a protector, right? But then all of a sudden, like, you never really put much time and effort into being it, but you always like kind of were like, man, I need to add that into my arsenal because I was told as a man, that's what I need to be. It's what I saw in media. That's what I was told by, you know, my influences in my life. And you're like, but I never really aligned with that. So all of a sudden, now you're 30 years old. You've never taken the time to really be like a protector. You've never trained consistently. You don't do any of the things that like protectors would do, but you still have this kind of like, oh man, I still think that needs to be part of me. Well, there's always going to be a misalignment there. And then you're always going to have some form of subconscious sadness and depression and anxiety towards that because you haven't achieved a part of your personality that you were told you were supposed to have. So that is where I think where you're seeing a lot of guys, sometimes it's not hormonal, sometimes it's just psychological. And when those guys can psychologically come to terms with that, I mean, as we all know, your brain can influence your hormones, right? So like if you actually have that right psychology around that, you can influence a positive reaction within your chemical reaction within your body. And so when we talk about that, it's like, okay, guys, you're going to have that misalignment because you never actually valued being a protector. And that's okay. Maybe there's other values as a man that you really, really loved, but you never incorporated them into your personality, but you inherently felt like they needed to be part of you. Those are what you should be looking at. Those are what you align with. And that's going to take you out of that depression, out of that fog, because you're going to say, hey, I'm living to a standard that I actually feel aligned and connected to. That's where we have to get. If we really want to eradicate this sadness and this depression, like society takes all kinds of role members. And this is what I was talking about in one of my episodes recently about the alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and omega males. is that it takes all kinds of role players. And not everybody is the same. Not everybody is an alpha leader. Not everybody is a beta who's the second in command. Some people are the gammas, and that's like the third in the hierarchical structure. They're very great supporting cast members. Maybe that's just who you feel aligned with. It doesn't mean that that's negative. It just means that that's the man that you really feel connected with and you feel good about being. So embrace that. Don't allow society to tell you that that's wrong.
Yeah, I love that, man. Well, we got to unfortunately start to wrap it up here. So I know we could talk forever.
I know. I was like, oh, shoot, I'm taking forever.
Continue. We always do. We talked about your book. Your book's going to be coming out hopefully by the middle of the year. So it's going to be coming out. What all services do you offer? Where can people find you at? Give us the whole spiel.
Yeah, brother. I appreciate it, man. And always love jamming out with you. So yeah, we could talk forever to just be like a 17-hour podcast. But yeah, you guys can find me at johnnyelsasser.com. That's where you can find everything that I'm doing, from my experiences to the subscription program that I have, which is the Elite Man Community. And that's really just helping guys come around and figure out how to have this mindset of putting themselves first and giving themselves that self-assessment so they really can understand who they are and become elite in their own mind as to the person that they show up as the man they show up as. So I have that as well. You can find that at the website. And then the podcast, The Art of Masculinity. Jacque, you've been on there a few times, and it's a podcast where we just open the door to a lot of different conversations around masculinity and what that looks like in the world today. So those are really the key places. Oh, and Instagram is where I think I hang out the most on, I guess. And that's just Johnny.Elsasser on Instagram.
Awesome, man. Again, thank you for being on yet again. I'm sure this is not going to be the last time that I have you on here, but I appreciate you carving out the time today to jam out with me, man.
Of course, brother. Always appreciate you.